presentation again, so that we can kind of ask some questions and get it ironed out and drilled down and ready to go. Okay, so Sean, I'm going to have you go first and maybe just give us a little bio for those of us that don't know you yet, to kind of talk about your background and your connections in DC as well as in the state of Florida.
Absolutely. One quick question I wanted to ask, would I have the power to share my screen so I can go through a PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah, hang on one second. We'll make that happen for you.
Thank you.
Just do it.
Should be all set.
Okay.
Okay, let's see here. Now I'm kind of new to this, so bear with me here.
That's why you need millennials. They're
Yep.
very good at this type of thing.
That is absolutely true. So let's see here. Now, can you all see that?
Yep.
Excellent. All right.
I did, and it disappeared. I'm not sure. I've got to find it now. Did anybody else lose it?
Mike, is that you?
Yeah, it showed up briefly, and then I went to menu.
I see it. Looks nice
Do you
to
see
me.
it, Renee?
Yes.
Do you see it, Mr.
VNF
Silka?
Solutions.
I'm on a laptop. Sometimes they're challenged. See. Well, go ahead and start, and I'll find it somehow.
Yeah.
Well, if not, I could probably, Sean, if you want to email that to me, I could forward it, or if you want to send it to Mr.
Yeah.
It's better for me to see it on the screen. I can't access email easily.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. So, well, Jennifer, thank you for the time. I really appreciate the opportunity. Always good to speak to folks in Florida. I'll share a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Gainesville. Family's from Michigan, but ran away from a blizzard in the late 60s and never turned back. So I grew up down there with my siblings, went to Florida Atlantic University where I studied political science and did an internship in former Senator Connie Mack's office. Had a great time there, really caught the political bug, focused my efforts on environmental restoration. We were working on Everglades restoration at the time, passing some comprehensive Everglades restoration reform language that was adopted soon thereafter. A lot of interesting work there. Spent another couple of years working for Senator Judd Gregg from New Hampshire, completely different issues, but focused on environmental issues as well. And then joined in 2004 Governor Jeb Bush's office as his natural resource policy analyst in his DC office. The state of Florida and about 36 or so other states have DC offices able to connect a little quicker in real time with the delegation. So great delegation connections when I was there. It was a lot of fun being young and working with both sides of the aisle on Everglades restoration, which coastal resiliency, things like that. There are a number of issues, water-related issues in particular, that the delegation comes together on. Has always kind of seen the right path forward on, and that was very, you know, it was kind of eye-opening to me, and I still look back on it quite a bit because there's so much partisan banter back and forth these days, and grumbling, and I truly miss those days. But it was a good time, and I've been lobbying for about 16 years now. I'm with Van S. Feldman. I was at a smaller shop before that.
John, this is Mike. Can I stop you for a second?
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
I'm trying to see if what I have, I see a Gartner report on my screen. Is that incorrect? It says the Magic Quadrant for Meeting Solutions. Is that correct? That's not the right thing.
There should be one about VNF Solutions that I was about to get
Okay,
to.
so I have to keep working on finding it then.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's not you. Keep going.
I'll be sure to share it with you afterwards, though. So I've been with Van S. Feldman for about 5 years now, very focused on representing utilities, cities, irrigation districts, and whatnot on water issues, a lot of environmental restoration and resiliency issues. I'll speak briefly about VNF Solutions, which is sort of a entity within our firm, VNF, Van S. Feldman. The law firm. The solutions piece is based more on doing work on the lobbying side of efforts. We created it to be able to sort of separate from legal work. Not that we can't do it for both, but it just makes it a little easier for those clients who we represent on the legal side as well. So I'm coming at you today from VNF Solutions. We're an integrated consulting firm with about 100 professionals. We have a Washington, D.C. office, Seattle, Denver, just added a New Orleans office, and San Francisco Bay Area office. And it's a bipartisan group of folks, a lot of collaboration. We have a number of folks who worked in administrations dating all the way back to George Bush Sr. We have folks that have run two folks that have run the Council of Environmental Quality in the White House, only not just the Democrat side of the aisle, but also Republican side of the aisle. Folks at EPA, folks at the Department of Interior, a lot of folks that have served in administrations over the years, as well as folks that have come from the Hill like myself. The firm was founded by 4 members that are former counsel to House and Senate committees, Natural Resources and Energy and Environment, but those were older names back in the day. They've since changed those names, but a lot of the firm was based on environmental and energy related work, and we continue to do so today, although we've dabbled in quite a few other things. But as you see here on the list, we focus very much on community resiliency, pre-disaster mitigation, and disaster recovery efforts, hurricane related and otherwise. In some states, it's earthquake related, and like out west, we do a lot of endangered species work and actually represent NESARC, which is an endangered species organization made up of a number of private and public entities in the United States. Do a lot of energy, environment, natural resources work, which I said, and then a lot of infrastructure work, which I'll talk to you about in just a minute, given the fact that it looks like we're going to finally see a big infrastructure package, if not 2, come forward this year now that we have Biden administration and Democrats in control of the House and the Senate. It's going to be a little easier for them to push a deal through, which was a problem during the Trump administration, and finding a way to pay for things that really held up the ball from moving forward. But moving on to the next slide, just a list of some of the clients that we represent. We've done, as I mentioned before, a number of restoration effort works. My work going back to this, working with the state of Florida on an Everglades restoration, and also dealing with water quality issues. I represented the 5 water management districts, not only when I was in the governor's office, but also in the private sector shortly thereafter. We worked with Sonoma County Water District on this list here for environmental.
Sean, this
Yep.
is John Sylvia. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Have you dealt with any offshore island restoration issues?
We have, and actually Louisiana CPRA there at the top. It's the largest coastal restoration effort in the United States right now. And our firm is focused on that one, yes. And I apologize, probably should have just started with that one right off the bat. We've secured just over the last couple of years and working with the Trump administration and now working with the Biden administration, the first MOU between a state entity and the federal government. That has never happened before. This is allowing coastal restoration efforts in the state of Louisiana to begin restoration. Now it's above and beyond sort of the wetlands areas that we're used to, but in Louisiana, they're losing roughly a football size amount of sand every hour in the state. Their coastal maps have dropped dramatically. Communities have had to move off of these coastal islands. So it's a big effort to push forward on that. It's going to be a multi-billion-dollar effort. We've already secured $600 million for them in funding, basically to write off the initial project. Again, this is going to take years to do, but to get the project going right off the bat. This will be our first appropriations request this year for through the federal government system, because all these authorizations just happened. The Water Resources Development Act, which was actually used for you all to get your Lee County and Captiva Sanibel Island beach renourishment project authorized, is the exact same program, or the exact same bill that we used to authorize the Louisiana hurricane storm and damage risk reduction system, which was quite a lift, but it's a success story that we like to share. And it has a lot to do with the efforts that we're doing throughout the Gulf in restoration efforts.
John, could you elaborate? Because I'm trying to follow it. Which bill is this that you think is similar to what we use for renourishment?
Yeah, so this is the Water Resources Development Act, and it authorizes Army Corps projects.
Mhm.
And Congress authorizes the bill
That's
every.
called WRDA typically.
Yes, WRDA. Yes. Sorry. I know some use acronyms, some don't. I'm trying to simplify it. Yes. The WRDA
I'm
bill.
quite familiar with that relative to water quality and some other issues.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of it being related to beach renourishment, though.
Yes, actually, it does a lot of things, even though the Army Corps only has supposedly 3 real core mission statements, and that's flood control, navigation, and ecosystem restoration. The ecosystem restoration part is arguably Everglades restoration, Louisiana restoration. There's a few other projects out there, as well as beach renourishment projects throughout the United States.
Because let me continue on that for a moment, because when John asked the question, I know I've often heard people use the word restoration in lieu of renourishment. But typically I've found in dealing with the governments, they view restoration as restoring something that needs to exist, and renourishment as something that is more arbitrary and doesn't necessarily support nature's natural approach. So it tends to be complicated. And we're under a special, in Florida anyway, a special Beach Preservation Act. But I think we've often run into issues with Congress and others claiming that, well, you know, it's just erosion, and whatever it is, it's natural, it's not restoration. So I'm just saying that there's a fine distinction there that we would argue against, but clearly what we've been up against is people who claim they're not the same thing, restoration and renourishment.
Absolutely, and kind of
Excuse me, can I interject, Chairman? I would ask the board that these are all excellent questions, but in a courtesy, we might be all better served if he could, and also in lieu of time, if we could have the presentation and then think of our questions. And I just think, because what happens is someone is singing their song and we're interrupting, and it's.
Now you want us to shut up, so let's all shut up and let him continue.
Thank you.
I completely understand. I will hit on that point real quick, though. With regards to CPRA, much like what you all have heard from the federal government in the past, is that yes, renourishment is just basically protection of, more often than not, private property, right? And it's humans that are being protected there. I think with regards to CPRA and some of the changing messages in Washington, D.C. are that by losing these islands, not only are we losing the flood protections from hurricanes and other storms for the personal, the human factor there, but we're also losing with the loss of those islands a lot of places for habitat, not only marine habitat, but also birds that migrate through north and south throughout the cycle of the year. The same argument can be made for the beaches on Captiva Island with regards to sea turtles. And I think that's something that we're starting to pick up. So I did want to make that point real quick. Appreciate it. Comprehensive federal support. I know that you've had a lobbyist before. I will tell you this, that if you do decide to go with a lobbyist, whether it's me or someone else, that person should always provide something above and beyond just what your original ask is. That there's whether it's to remedy the Army Corps existing authorization so that you can get back into compliance and move forward on that project. You have an authorization through 2038, so you could probably get 2 more cycles in there. That's important. I understand that, but coastal resiliency is the overall issue here. And that takes place on both sides, not just the ocean side, but also the bay side. So there's some opportunities there for us to look at program-wise above and beyond just the Army Corps. But it's also about identifying legislation. And one of those things I'm going to talk about in a bit is the infrastructure project program that is going to be released by the Biden administration. There's going to be some broad resiliency provisions in there, and it gives us an opportunity to weigh in on how we'd like to see that fit for Captiva Island and other barrier islands. And there are coalitions out there in the US that are talking about these issues. We work with a number of folks, like I said, in Louisiana, as well as folks in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas on these issues. Having a coalition speak on your behalf makes it a whole lot easier for members of Congress to understand the larger picture. Those are some of the things that we track. We leverage relationships. Obviously, we've worked on a number of these issues in the past. making introductions within folks at the White House and/or with members of Congress above and beyond your own delegation, who are going to be fabulous at what they can do as far as supporting us, but making sure that other members that serve on particular committees, lead particular committees on the Hill, and or those that are making decisions within the administration are kind of up to speed on what's happening. And the fact that we're here to work together, we want to find solutions that we can all agree on moving forward. Partnerships are key. Obviously, this is a big deal. It goes above and beyond just sort of the local aspects of things. But you know, I'll summarize this quickly because I wanted to put some emphasis on some of the other programs that are out there. But with regards to your current Lee County Erosion Control Project, we know where you are. You got an authorization in 1988. You haven't had a beach renourishment with a federal sponsor in some time now. Again, you're authorized through 2038. Requirements change. That happened with the Corps of Engineers, and that's one of the reasons why you're forced to go through this process these days. I think there is a path forward. I'm not quite sure because I haven't been on the ground yet myself due to COVID. I'd love to get down, but a path forward for the entire island, but I certainly think there's a path forward for at least half of the island. There's some concerns with regards to public access on portions of the island, but I think that's a community-based effort that obviously, even at a federal level, we would work with you on. So that's a key thing. And again, with those, getting those things locally accomplished regarding you know, the need for more public access, I think that really the community outreach and then getting participation from those key folks locally is really going to lead towards a path forward on that front. That may take some time, but I don't think it should take forever. This is not something that should take years to get done. I think this just has to be some very serious conversations that take place as you speak about the benefit for all on the island, especially those possibly on the north end and some of these private communities, to get way in and find a solution moving forward. But I think it can be done, and I think that's something, you know, that you all can obviously team up with me or whoever else you decide to choose if you go with someone else and get that done probably within the next year. Other federal opportunities that are out there I'd like to briefly speak about. Probably the biggest one and the one we work with mostly is the National Coastal Resiliency Fund. We teamed up with them originally in Louisiana. This is a broad organization. The organization that administers it, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, is a broad organization that was actually created by Congress. A lot of folks think it's a private entity, but it is not. They'll get it confused with you know, conservationist groups like Sierra Club and whatnot, or environmental groups like that. But they administer a National Coastal Resiliency Fund, and they have a number of programs. They have a sea turtles program in particular, which I think is of interest. The Gulf Environment Benefit Fund is actually, I believe, is coming due in April. I can get you a date on that, but I don't think they've quite announced the final date, but I believe it's going to be sometime in April. So applications due for that. It's not a heavy lift process-wise. It's something that can be easily done. We also have some folks on the ground there that could walk us through the process with regards to some questions you all might have on ensuring that you're putting forth, you know, your best application. Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and I think we're going to see more expansion on this in an infrastructure package, because coastal resiliency, as well as just resiliency throughout the United States from climate change and extreme weather, has become a huge talking point in Washington, not just because of the number of hurricanes that we're seeing in the Gulf and in the Southeast, but also drastic and extreme weather in the Midwest, flooding through the Mississippi Valley. Superstorm Sandy really changed the way people address these things. It started before that in Louisiana following Hurricane Katrina, but it really kicked in after Superstorm Sandy, and folks are starting to realize that there has to be something done in advance of this. So we're seeing some of these efforts on mainland facilities in Miami and whatnot, but I think we've got some opportunities there to work with folks off the shore to ensure that the sand is not as lost as quickly as it has been in recent years, and securing some areas there, and also maybe creating a flourishing habitat for mammals and fish off the coast. And then again, nature-based infrastructure, you all have probably heard this before, but that is a big piece in moving forward in just about any additional authorization programs that are going to come about from Congress. Everybody is all about nature-based, whether it's home protections or it's environmental protections, if it's about taking concrete away like we did in Florida from running waters off of floodwaters off of the middle of the state through the Everglades and out to the coastal areas, removing those and turning them back to a nature-based cycle is really what's taking place in the Everglades and throughout the country altogether. And I think that there could be some opportunities there as well. You don't have the mangrove facility, natural facility like we do in the southern tip of Florida, closer to the Everglades, but there are some other opportunities out there I think that we could look into. And then Coastal Zone Management Act, a lot of these sort of have to come together all together, but there is I think what we're seeing is there's more of a dialogue between the different agencies, not just at the federal level, but also working with state folks and matching state and local funds. And that's going to be a key piece moving forward. Every project really that and you all are dealing with this in Captiva is that every project needs to have some sort of local buy-in. Whether you're building a water infrastructure project or a wastewater project or roads or whatnot, there needs to be a local buy-in. So just about every program that you're going to look at in the future with regards to assisting on your restoration and or at least keeping status quo on the island with regards to storm reduction impediments is that you're going to have to deal with some sort of local match. But that federal match could range from all kinds of 75%, sometimes federal, all the way down to like a 25%. But the key is to find the programs that work best for you. And I think that's where I can come in and provide assistance. Moving on to the next one, I don't want to take up too much time here. Just a quick outlook. I kind of talked about this. New administration, Biden administration is very focused on climate change. They are going to be looking again at coastal resiliency with a Congress being led by Democrats in the House and Senate. We're also going to see a lot of that. It's an opportunity for us and other communities to weigh in on these programs, the importance of these programs. And I'd say the key number is the amount of money that can be saved by putting these natural facilities in place in advance of future storms. And it saves often billions of dollars in flood mitigation and whatnot. And that's where you sort of get fiscally conservative Republicans to the table, which has been, I'm a Republican, has been an issue for a number of years, trying to get folks to the table to say, hey, it makes more sense to spend money up front to deal with these and build a resilient community than it does to have to deal with it after the fact. So we're going to see I think a lot of conversation on that front over the next year. With regards to how quickly we see an infrastructure package come together, just this week, the administration hinted that they may break it up into two packages. One, they would push through a process called budget reconciliation. You all have probably seen a little bit on this on the news, the COVID relief package moving through the House right now. It's a $1.9 trillion package, is being moved through the budget reconciliation process, which allows just a simple majority passage in both the House and Senate. In the Senate, more often than not, it takes 60 votes to end debate on a bill. They will not need to do that. Once the House passes the bill, the Senate can take it up, amend it, and then they can work on a conference bill and send it to the president. Obviously, something you can really only do when you control all three sectors of the federal government on that front, the House, the Senate, and the White House. So they're going to move forward in that. We're expecting that there'll be a package that will move through budget reconciliation, and again, expeditiously, probably get done later, I'd say early to mid-summer, the initial one. And I don't know what plans or projects are going to be included in either one of those. I just know that this will be there. The other piece will probably more be of a bipartisan effort, and that will likely move towards the end of the year and or early 2022. And that's it from mine. Open it up for questions.
So as chairman, before we open it up to the rest of the board, is Bob Gray there? Did he come in, Jennifer?
Yes, he's in my office.
Okay, great. Sean, thank you very much. It was very nice. It's nice meeting you. I have Bob has been acting as a procedural consultant, but his background is interesting insofar as one of his clients is the the largest teachers union, which is New York City's teachers union for the past 20 years. And I would just like Bob to ask a couple of or to make some points. Real briefly, Bob and I just met and we just had a little intellectual discourse. And it was, I think, Bob, he did kind of hit the points that you were going to ask him, but I would still like you to ask him so the rest of the board can hear this. And then I'll let the board have at it. And then I'll end it. Go ahead, Bob. Bob, yeah. Microphone.
I had to be unmuted. Can you hear
Okay.
me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Sean. Nice to meet you. You know, one of the things that I wasn't clear on with the different avenues that you were talking about for getting federal funding, do they all eventually funnel through the Army Corps, or does the funding for these things come outside of that?
So that's a good question. The programs are separate themselves. There are programs that are that work through NOAA. EPA has programs. Army Corps has programs. So there's a number of different agencies that you can tap into. If we had a slightly different community, you could even tap into some of the conservation funds that are through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But I don't think in our and they do a lot of marine work actually and coastal work. But I'm not quite. I didn't want to mention that today because I'm not quite convinced that that would apply here. But yes.
And is there, can we participate in more than one federal program at a time?
You can, and that's where it can get a little tricky. For instance, if there was an opportunity for us to do some work on the bay side, because obviously that's a different habitat than it is on the Gulf side, and I don't know if that's necessarily a concern, but I'm just giving you an example. Then we could work on something on that side, opposed to something on the federal side. I think the big key is what program works in the near term for us, and then what program might work in the long term. Is there something we'd like to find in the short term as a solution, you know, for the next couple of years, and or is there something larger that we could tap into? And that could be an authorization. I mean, we already have one for obviously beach renourishment through the Army Corps of Engineers, but we're talking about more of a coastal resiliency effort along, and that might actually go above and beyond. And when I think about that, I think more about Lee County in general, because the larger and more regional impact it is on the economy, and that means tourism, that means protection of homes and habitat, then you got a bigger buy-in there, and that's a good piece.
And just my last question would be, when you talked about a lot of these programs now require local funding to put up in order to get matching funds. When you talk about local funding, is that like for Captiva, there's property tax funding directly from, not property tax, it's a special assessment directly from the Captiva landowners, and then there's local county funding. So for the programs that want you to match things, can we count funds that we get from Lee County as part of the matching funds?
Absolutely. There shouldn't be any restrictions as long as the funding that comes from Lee County did not actually come from the federal government through another program. Sometimes that can be a little confusing, and it's called double dipping, and that's a no-no. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. I think you did cover the points that Renee and I had talked about earlier today.
Great.
And I have this is Mike. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to keep it focused. One is, I don't want to belabor this one, but you touched on resiliency, and I think that's an important issue of what happens on the non-beach side of Captiva. And there's a lot of work to be done there. I'd like to follow up on that at some point in the future, but we're definitely looking at sea level rise concerns and increased resiliency. So that's a big issue. You touched on a few of those points. We'd want to follow up on that another time. The other thing is, when you mentioned about how it would be easier to get funding for half of Captiva, I think is what you said, but I'm assuming that you mean the fact that the South Seas Resort is not open to the public on the top 2+ miles of the island. And when I first talked to the Army Corps of Engineers after I joined this board years ago, they said, why do you include that area? Because there's a lack of openness to the public, whereas the public access on the south end, the first 3.5 miles of the island or whatever, is much more open to the public, and we would get a much bigger share from the Army Corps. Is that what you were referring to when you mentioned that?
Yeah, I was just referring to that any remedies that needed to take place on that portion of the island would be easier to get to easier to resolve. Not that not that I mean you should move away from getting the entire island covered under the original authorization footprint, because that's what you should try to do. I mean, we should attempt to do that no matter what. But that's a decision that has to,
I understand, but this is a question that has been raised by the public from time to time. It was first brought to my attention by Jackie Kaiser, formerly the top Army Corps person in the state. And it's something that does keep coming up, because the fact is that the public access we have at Turner Beach and Hagarup Beach, and then Andy Rossi Lane, and what Leica, and whatever level of access they provide, it's all outside the resort. And yet we're asking for money for the entire island. And so we lose whatever benefit we get on the south end because of this large exclusive area, if you will, on the north end.
correct.
And I think that's a question that we as a board have to be able to answer, or our apportionment has to be adjusted to be able to provide better.
Yeah, the answer is apportionment. And
Yeah, that's an answer.
dealing with
Better,
apportionment.
better benefits to the
Right.
areas that provide access and less benefits to the areas that are
That's
exclusive.
right. What are the other
Forgive me if
questions?
I sound like I'm losing breath because I'm on my stationary bike at the same time.
So Mike, John, do you have a question? Then we can go back to Mike.
Yeah, John, my question goes back to something that I think Jennifer brought up. Again, it is beach access. And the comment was that because of some of the signs, particularly again, on the street that I live on, Whiteman, but Leica, and I think it was Chapman was another one, that there's an impression that people don't have the beach access through those streets. And so again, Jennifer may clarify this, but my impression is it's the Army Corps of Engineers that decided that they weren't going to give us any funding because of those signs. Is that something that you can deal with? And it seems more of an administrative issue. It doesn't seem like a big issue.
Absolutely. And I think, oh, sorry, Jennifer, did you want to?
No, go ahead. You go ahead, Sean.
Yep.
There was
So,
one
yeah,
little bit about,
Wait. Let Sean, you go, and then I'm gonna let John kind of clarify, but go ahead.
okay. Yeah. Yes, this is absolutely something we can work on. And again, I think it's part of the overall message that needs to be shared with the Corps when we're ready to say this, we want back into the authorization, into the program. And here's what we've done to get us there. Now, whether that's just a portion of the island, and again, those are conversations that'll take place over the next couple of months, or if it's the entire island and here's what we've done, it can all be resolved. Yes. And that's, I wouldn't be able to say if that was the reason, but all the Corps really needs is a portion of that project where somebody could be walking down the beach and say, there's no public access for a quarter of a mile here. And then they go back and say, you know what, you're out of compliance. And because your compliance exists of this much property, you lose it all. And that's the issue. Now we could go back ultimately and change the project dimensions, but that's a conversation that I think you wouldn't want to have now. It's something you have down the line if you can't remedy all the issues on the island.
Or change the signs.
Or change the signs. Exactly right.
Hey, John, this is Mike Mullins.
Yes.
I'd say that the most egregious limitation of access is on the north end in South Seas, because you can't technically get into it.
I agree.
And by and far, that's 95% of the problem. But apparently we were told by the Army Corps representatives that came to see us to talk about why we lost funding, that somebody in their chain of command, whatever term they use a different term, but somebody higher up came and stayed on Captiva and saw this big lack of access on the north end, saw signs on a few different streets and so on. And I don't know that they particularly mentioned Leica or Whiteman. However, they did point out all along Tweenwater Stretch and so on, that people have private down here on the south end. There's some people on the beach that have a sign that say private access. So generally the sense is there isn't a lot of openness to public access.
Mhm.
And in some cases we could change the signs. But another thing that I was mentioning to Jennifer that I'm trying to do, and we need somebody to follow up on it, is to try to turn the McCarthy Marina parking area, which is an acknowledged parking area for use by their customers, into something that's more broadly available. And it's a half a mile south of Hagarup. So there's parking a quarter mile in each direction, essentially it offers. If we could make a deal with them to be able to have some exclusive use parts of the year, that might help us, not only with the Army Corps of Engineer, but we have a similar problem with the state and the county. They all use this access, public access as part of their formula.
But-
So
but
those are steps
gentlemen,
that would go a long way with the Army Corps, but also help us with the state and the county.
Okay.
Gentlemen, we're drilling down on tactics. I think this is an opportunity to speak and not tell him what our thoughts are, but more of a, understanding his lobbyist efforts and sort of general questions. These are things that are very paramount to us, and we think they're going to be very effective measures. But I don't think this should be the nature of the questions. This is sort of getting to know him and see where, how we could work with him. I mean, your points are tremendously important, but I don't know if this is the workshop for it. It's more of, does Sean here have the wherewithal in his organization to get us what we need? And these should be the questions. May I ask a question? Thank you. All right, so I've always been a big believer that we know that we have to deal with our local state senator, our local House person, our two senators, U.S. and for federal. And in the past, in my personal lobbying efforts, I've found, and I'll just be very blunt, and I am not a Republican. I am an independent with Democratic DNA. However, I've probably raised 7 figures over the past 20 years for mostly Republican candidates, anywhere from U.S. Senator to local school board on my terrace in Captiva. So I'd like to think that I have a good rapport with everybody. But what I'm trying to say is that me personally would like to see a lobbyist organization that has the ability to maybe have access. Let's say, for example, we have access to like the assistant to the deputy of the Secretary of the Interior. And I'm just using that as an example because maybe someone in our organization has a great concept. And even though we can go to our a local senator, a state senator, and all that, we're looking for the lobbyist firm to say, listen, I went to school with so-and-so. They got to hear what you have to say. And then and I'm using this, probably not the best analogy, but what I'm trying to say, Jean, is that it's who you know and how you know them, because it could really go a long way from the procurement of natural resources to keep our island the way it is, by knowing the right people that make the ultimate decision. Said, I like hearing that, and I ran it by my boss, so he wants you to call this department. So versus the typical we have Senator Rick Scott, one of the 10 senators that voted against the certification. So sometimes if he's representing something, it might get killed just for spite. We have other people that really aren't the sharpest tools in the shed. This is the deck we've been dealt. I'll be candid, and I can say what I want, because at the end of the day, they're still going to call me to raise money. So I really can say whatever I feel like. So with that being said, but so in finality, can you just give us an example of where you feel you have strong relationships with, even if they're not the acceptable person of our local House guy or local Senate guy, and the people that I mentioned? I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the environmental work that I do, because we do separate it to some extent. We do a lot of energy work. So you have a whole side of the firm that does pipelines, gas, oil, and things like that. I don't work on any of those issues other than representation on some of the natural sides of things, because obviously these folks do work in the Gulf of Mexico, things like that. They provide money to programs and whatnot. But the folks I work with, we have a number of folks, and I kind of hinted on that earlier. We have 2 folks that used to serve at the Council of Environmental Quality. Depends what organization, what administration is, but they tend to be the top. They bring all of the agencies together on environmental policy. This administration is going to go a little different way. They've announced that Gina McCarthy is going to be sort of the climate czar, domestic climate czar, right? Obviously, Senator Kerry is going to be sort of the international piece to that, working with the UN and elsewhere. But Gina McCarthy is the climate czar. One of my colleagues, Gwen Keyes Fleming, used to be her chief of staff and was Region 4 administrator at EPA. So she actually had Florida under her belt when she was there, and that was during the Obama administration. So a lot of the Obama folks are obviously there with the Biden folks, right? Because you know, if you know the folks that do the best work, you just bring them back in. And we've seen a lot of that. We've actually had about 5 or 6 of our associates at our firm join the administration. One at EPA, one at Department of Transportation, another one at Energy, and then one actually in the climate office, Megan Saransky, who's a counsel for Gina McCarthy in the office. She worked with us about 4 or 5 years ago, actually just a little bit before me, so about 5 or 6 years ago at the firm. And she does environmental issues as well. So
Anyone else you have connections with?
yeah, we've got plenty of ties with EPA. We've worked closely. I work on one of those issues, PFAS, which is the 4,000 or 5,000 different chemical compounds that have been polluting the country. You hear about it a lot during firefighting incidences. It's a compound that was created by accident in the late 30s. It's used to put out extreme fire events. So these would be airport fires, fires on ships, but it's also in all kinds of products that we use on a daily basis. It's what makes up Teflon. So those things ultimately don't biodegrade. They just never go away. They end up in our waters, they end up on our fish and whatnot. I've done a lot of work with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, on that, and actually used to work and have worked in coalition with folks, including Michael Regan, who is soon will be the new EPA administrator. He was cleared by the committee and will be voted on the Senate floor shortly. He's led the effort when he was the secretary, I guess he still is, the secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality in the state of North Carolina. And we've worked closely with his office as well.
Thank you. Jennifer, you had some questions? Or did Dan, or you said?
I didn't have any questions, but I was going to have John clarify what Mr. Silvio was saying regarding the signage that is very.
Let's stay away from that. That's a tactic. I mean, we know that, but it's.
That's all I had. I just wanted Sean to again kind of reiterate some of the other funding options, not only that he could help us with Army Corps, but also some of these other initiatives.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, there's, like I said, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities throughout the agencies. It depends on the request, and I will say this: there are opportunities to work with multiple programs when one program may be very specific to beach renourishment, while another one may be specific to an endangered species issue. And with regards to the turtles and any other habitat on the island that might need assistance, human assistance, in preserving their natural habitat, that's where we can tap into. Sometimes it depends, but you can tap into alternative programs as well to get to a solution for both issues, not only just human but also nature.
So Sean, then, so for example, with our erosion project, we utilize the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation to move the turtle nests, and we pay for that. So if there was a grant opportunity where, say, we could utilize those funds, then we could reimburse ourselves, correct? Say for paying, not only did we approve to pay for the turtle nest movement for their turtle technicians, they're called turtle technicians, yes. And we also approved a research project as to why there's more turtle nesting in Sanibel versus Captiva. So would that be something, say, we could reimburse our district for, should we get that type of a grant?
Yes, studies and efforts like that often are in a completely different separate batch of money. That can come through NOAA, it can come through EPA, it can come through a number of different organizations. So yes, absolutely.
Also, so I went to our legislative luncheon with our Southwest Florida delegation on Tuesday, and was invited by Representative Botana, Adam Botana, to come up to Tallahassee in a few weeks and meet with him regarding our governor's coastal resiliency $1 billion that he wants in the budget for that. That ties along with the federal plan, correct? You talked about how the feds are also doing coastal resiliency. So I guess my question is, say that funding becomes available not only with our state, but then it would also become available with the feds. So therefore we could technically get get money out of two different buckets, correct?
Yes, you could use the state funding as long as it had no federal connection. And my understanding of the announcement, it is not. It is state tax, so it comes from the state's revenues. You could use that as an offset for your local match against any federal dollars. Yes.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I have so far.
Mike, didn't you have it? Oh, no, Bob has a question. Go ahead, Bob. Then Mike next.
Just to follow on to Jennifer's question about the sea turtles, could we make the case that the beach nourishment itself is protecting sea turtle habitat and get part of the beach nourishment paid for by this other grant?
Yes, you absolutely could. And when I first talked to Jennifer about this, there's obviously some things to maneuver there. But when she first brought this issue up and we were introduced, I said, do you have any endangered species on the island? And I'm thinking, of course, there's turtles, because it's hard to find a beach in Florida where there aren't any turtles. But that is a huge piece, especially as a barrier island. I mean, it's even more important, right? Because that habitat is generational. They go back to the same place that they're born, and that's extremely important in the future. So yes, there is an aspect to that. Now, I will tell you this: when working with the Army Corps of Engineers, they don't necessarily see it that way. That's why we would look at other opportunities through, maybe a grant opportunity or whatnot through, National Fish and Wildlife as well, or somebody like that. Yeah.
Mike, you had a question?
First of all, Sean, you comported yourself quite well in this presentation and represented your firm and what you do generally very well. When we first met, I mentioned to you that years ago, before the Army Corps pulled its money out, the board had hired a lobbyist who was a Washington lobbyist focusing just on beach nourishment, called the Sandman was his title. And I was the one board member. All four voted to go ahead and hire him. I voted against it, largely because I felt, how can we measure cause and effect? How can we determine whether he's doing his work as we go along, as opposed to getting to the final analysis, and when it comes time to get the money, find out that we have no money coming? And the conclusion was they didn't choose to try to identify that. Apparently, my understanding is that you can't be paid contingent upon performance, that it's against the law to do that with lobbyists, more or less, right?
Correct. Yes, sir.
So I was trying to find some other way to say, what metrics can we use to determine that we're getting, results for our money? In the end, none was determined. There were no status reports or anything that let us know what was going on. And then the plug got pulled, and we found out, surprise, surprise, at the absolute last minute. And I felt very much that we had been rope-a-doped into thinking the money was coming, and ultimately nothing came. We could have known much earlier on the issues that the Army Corps had and stopped paying. So now, not to, demean you or your industry with that, but that's a concern of mine, is how do we know that we're going to get bang for the buck? Or how do we measure along the way whether or not you're doing your job? And I would do this with anybody. The staff knows that I'm constantly asking for, where's our status reports? How do we know that we're doing the things we're supposed to be doing, and then what are our results, et cetera? So can you talk to that issue of what you can do, any firm can do, to assure us that we're putting money in and we're going to get bang for the buck?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're, and I don't want to give you lip service here, but and everybody does it a little different. We're broad. We don't just focus on beach renourishment. There's a lot of restoration that takes place throughout the United States that we focus on, and obviously we do other issues, energy and transportation and whatnot. But and with regards to even fees, we can work that out. We do, some clients it's a flat fee. Sometimes it's time. Sometimes there is a success fee. It would not be in this case, because anytime, those are usually private entities. But I will tell you this: I don't think for a second that it should take years, much less a year, to even get to a point where we can go through studies and figure out exactly what needs to be done to get you back in compliance on the beach renourishment side. But while we're doing that, I would be focused on also the federal appropriations process that takes place every year. What grant opportunities can we reach out and apply for? And we should cast a broad net in that case. But we also want to be very specific about where, what we're focused on, whether it's, again, beach side, or we focused on endangered species issues with turtles or whatnot, or if we focused on some entity on the bay side as well. But there's plenty of opportunity out there. With regards to what I would do on a daily basis, I mean, I talk to my clients constantly. There's a monthly update, but more often than not, there's weekly updates. Here's what's happening in real time in Congress. They're moving legislation, and I understand you're a particular entity, but I'll give you an example, just working with specifically with special districts, which you are a special district. Special districts, which can be made up of 3 people in the room, 5 people in the room, 20 people in the room, right? There is a process through the current COVID relief legislation to allow special districts to get funding for lost revenue, right? Now, if you are, for instance, based on tax issues or taxed on, let's just say in Lee County, it's very, and most counties in the state of Florida, there's a tax on hotel occupancy, right? Those tax dollars are used for a lot of the programs that happen and in special districts around the state and the country. And you could have significant write-off on that because of the COVID experience that's taking place in pandemic right now. We've been working with those special districts to find an avenue forward so that they can receive a portion of those billions, if not trillions of dollars that is being spent. Those sorts of things would go above and beyond any of the natural resource issues that we're focused on here. Now, this might not necessarily apply to you all. I just don't know the tax base and how everything works there. But those are the things we're working for with communities. We're working for grant programs for first responders, working for water supply issues, all kinds of different things. So if there's anything that can pop up, those are the things we want to make you aware of, and then we discuss whether or not it's something you want to move forward on. So that's just an ongoing process.
John, earlier I said that you had also touched on resiliency, and I wasn't thinking so much of your work in that capacity as much as we have an upcoming beach project, and beach nourishment was a high priority. In the meetings I've been with in the Army Corps of Engineer at the FSBPA technical conference last year and other things, they pretty much spell out a process that they want to go through to guarantee some monies before you start a project. And we've missed most of those windows for whatever reason. We didn't address issues of easements. We didn't address the access issues. We continue to have obstacles, right? Now, so that means that we're not going to see them look to promise us any money anytime soon, but I know that there's opportunities to get reimbursement after the fact as well. I know that procedure lasts. However, the resiliency side of things with them and the state is that we're looking to do work relative to sea level rise, and we're taking on challenges separate from beach nourishment. And it would seem to me that that's an area where we should be able to, we're early enough, we should be able to get some money and create a comprehensive Captiva resiliency plan, if you will, and get some funding to support it. And I don't mind doing it in a match funding basis. We always do anyway. So I'm just wondering if it isn't better to start in that area, cut your teeth there, generate some results there as we sort out what are the things we have to do to fix our problems relative to access and easements. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I was trying to find a program right off the bat that we could apply for, and that would be through that coastal resiliency program. And we, a little inside baseball, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, but I will, because I guess it kind of shows where we're growing. The gentleman who actually runs the program, coastal resiliency program, will be joining the firm on Monday, Tanner Johnson. So he was not part of my original pitch because he doesn't work at the firm yet, but he'd be a gentleman that would be assisting me on these program opportunities for grants. And we have discussed some of the opportunities. He's been to Florida before. He's never been to Captiva. We talked about opportunities there. He asked about, the species on the island, and we got into a turtle conversation. So he's going to provide exceptional insight because he's been in on the program for a number of years now. And
His name is familiar. Is he coming from the Army Corps of Engineers?
No, sir. He's coming from I don't want to. He's coming from the program that's dealing with the sea turtles. He's coming from the National Coastal Resilience Fund. Okay. He's one of those folks that works with it through, and this is going to get confusing, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. He is one of their key folks there right now.
Well, not to lose sight of it, we also have endangered birds here. So that's enough on that subject for now, but we have more than the sea turtles.
Well, that's great then. Exactly. Habitat is a real important issue going forward. So,
Renee, can I ask a couple of quick questions?
Please.
Do you know Bob Motice?
The name sounds familiar, but no, sir.
You didn't work with him at Senator Mack's office?
No, was he local? I was there.
No, I worked with him when he was working for Senator Mack in DC.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
I
you
worked,
might know Bob.
yeah, no, I worked in there 99 to 2002. Sorry.
So the second question, probably Jennifer will know the answer to this. I don't know how generic the term sea turtles is, but I know we get more than one type of sea turtle on Captiva. And I don't know whether it's loggerhead or what it's called, but I know that we get several different types, and whether they're threatened or not endangered probably, but threatened, it might make a difference there. So check with Jennifer. She might know some of the details there.
So,
Yeah.
SCCF certainly knows all of them,
Yes,
and they're loggerhead and green turtles and a few of them, but that's a good point, John.
yes.
A quick interruption. Please continue as much as you like. I have to be turning an ignition key in 1 minute, so I'm going to excuse myself. And I just want to interject that very impressive and something we look forward to putting on the agenda to talk about hiring and the back and forth. Obviously, we can't make that answer now, but we're certainly going to think about it very carefully. And the other thing is with the apportionment, Jennifer, I can call you later along with Dan. But I think what's been discovered today is that the areas that don't have access, they're going to pay a little bit more. And we're going to pay a little bit less because we have the access. So I just want to leave that. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to excuse myself and
Pass the gavel to John, please.
pass the gavel to not you? All right, John, you're up, my friend. You're in charge.
Okay,
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
oh, yeah.
So, okay, so are we done with Mr. Taylor? Is everybody asked?
That's
enough
your
questions?
decision. That's John's decisions now.
Yes, I
Okay, well,
think we're done. I think we're done with John.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Sean, for being here, and I'll be in touch once I circle back with them, and we'll figure out to put you probably on our next agenda. Our next board meeting, voting board meeting is going to be March the 8th.
Okay.
So let me circle back with them, and then I'll reach back out to you either later this evening or tomorrow.
Sounds great. Happy to answer any questions moving forward, even
Okay.
whatever you got. So let me know. Thank
Okay.
you for the time. It's been a pleasure.
Yep, you're awesome. Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Chairman Sylvia, with your permission, I just wanted to make a comment before you.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
That is that the last apportionment session that was led by Dan, Renee didn't have the bandwidth to attend, and so he missed out on that segment. And I thought that the primary purpose that we reorganized this today was to allow him to get in on it before we got to a public meeting. So while I'm still interested in going forward and discussing it, I just want to point out that you're going to need to schedule another one where it's just Renee that's there, or do it first. That's all
I
I
may
want to
take
say.
care of that, Chair Mullins. I may take care of that with Dan. I'll reach out to Renee after this meeting and then see if I can set up just a meeting between him, myself, and Dan. Because I think you were exactly right. That's exactly why we rescheduled this.
Now, John
So I
is,
was a little surprised because I didn't realize that. So it's okay. We'll figure it out.
Thank you, Mike. So where are we now, folks?
So now, we are gonna have Dan Muntz do his apportionment PowerPoint that he did a few weeks ago, if you recall, Mr. Sylvia.
Yep.
And I know you were on that call. I know Mr. Mullins was on the call. But we're gonna have him go through that because he made some updates to it and kind of fine tuned it a little bit. And then my hope is that we have a really good understanding when we're finished. And then if we need to kick around some tweaks or figure out maybe we want to change something, we can manage that at this point since we're getting closer to the bids coming back in. That way we can kind of get our methodology kind of solidified. So that was the purpose. And then of course to review it with Chair McGill because he wasn't at the last one.
actually, Jennifer, this is Mike again, if with the chairman's permission. John and I have sat in on discussions in the past, and he was at the last meeting, and Bob Gray has been very involved, and some of the nuances have yet to be settled. But all the people who know the most about it on the board have actually been through the prior sessions. And so I think one thing we want to try to accomplish today is talk about whether we want to look at changes relative to giving benefits to those that provide greater public access and less benefits to those such as South Seas that are more exclusive and therefore hurt us from government funding. I don't want to talk about it right now, but I think that that's probably not factored into Dan's presentation, but that's something we'll have to analyze and decide on.
Mike, do you think that that was Renee, what Renee was commenting on before he left?
That's exactly what he was commenting on, yes.
Okay.
And that was what interestingly, that's why I was curious when, that's something that actually, to Sean's credit, he came up with in his conversations with the government before he got here. And that's why I asked him to clarify that earlier, because that's the first thing the Army Corps said to me back in 2006 when I joined the board. And they raised the question of, why do you guys include South Seas? That costs you a lot of money in terms of cost share from the federal government because they don't have any public access. Anyway, having said that, we need to figure out how to deal with that. That's a big issue.
Right. So I'm gonna go ahead then, if you're okay, Vice Chair Sylvia, I'm gonna go ahead and let Dan go on and do his presentation.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you're aware, this presentation doesn't include anything about, proximity to beach access, but it's the current state of where everything is. So the purpose of this slideshow is to, bring about discussion and communication and direction, as well as just an informational meeting. Taken from our enabling legislation, I've extracted out the actionable items, as well as listed which ones we've completed and the one we're currently at, the step we're currently at. So by our legislation, we're required to categorize areas of the beach of Captiva into areas and zones. And the engineer for the district shall prepare duplicate plans and specifications for each erosion prevention project and provide an estimated cost thereof. And then once we have the specifications and plans, which that's the step we're currently on, we're waiting on the finalization of the specs from the engineer. We'll have to host a meeting, a publicly advertised meeting, to hear any objections or to allow interested persons to speak about the subject. So a copy of that plan has to be filed with the board. And the next step following that, as an actionable item from our legislation, is we'll have to prepare a preliminary assessment roll, which is advisory only. Once we push that out, then we host another meeting to hear from the interested parties again. And those objections, they have to be in writing. And then once this has all been pushed out, we host another meeting to either sustain, modify, or annul the preliminary assessment. So that's kind of the steps ahead. That's been a question of where we were before. So that's taken from the enabling legislation. So talking about methodology, currently we have there's two benefits to this project. One's recreational and the other is storm protection. Recreational is obviously just recreational access to the beach for the public, and storm protection is the value to which having this project increases the protection in the event of a storm. These benefits are estimated in the same manner as previous assessments on Captiva Island. So talking about the storm protection benefits, these are for the properties that front on the Gulf of Mexico. The storm protection benefit, again, is the difference between the value of expected property losses if the project is constructed compared to the value of the losses if the project is not constructed. So the entire island of Captiva is one area, and we have 6 smaller zones, zones 1, 2, 3A, 3B, 4, and 5. On the screen, you can see a map of said zones and areas, as well as a written description that I've added in.
And that hasn't changed.
That has not changed.
Okay.
Okay, so digging a little deeper. So looking at the erosion rates of those zones, you can see that zone 1 and zone 3A have the highest erosion rates. followed by zone 2 and 5. And even though zones 3B and 4, they're relatively stable, but they're still vulnerable to storm damage. And you can see the annual storm benefits in table 2 of the private properties on Captiva broken down by zone and in percentage of their cost share. Now digging into the recreational benefit, this applies to all properties on Captiva. So it's the recreational value of the beach that's created. And so the recreational value of the beach was obtained from detailed surveys of more than 600 beach users on Captiva, and that was conducted during a 10-day period in the winter of 2018 and a 5-day period in the summer of 2018. The primary determinant of the value is the beach usage. And so properties which send or can send relatively large numbers of beach users on the beach receive relatively greater recreational benefits than the properties which send relatively few beach users onto the beach. And you can see on table 3, it's broken down single family, condominium, multifamily, and commercial properties and their percentage of the recreational benefit for the cost share. Speaking of cost shares, these shares are used to apportion the up to $18 million for the project. And properties in upper South Sea zone and single family and condo will pay the largest share of the cost project in the current methodology. So our plan ahead, so once the project's completed, we'll prepare the preliminary roll. Again, it's tentative because the final project costs, the grants, the property values, and the amounts in reserves are subject to change. And then following that, we'll annul, sustain, or modify the preliminary assessment rule. So a little history of the board direction. So we've grouped all the residential categories into one residential category and then split that apart, whether it's homesteaded or not homesteaded. And this is done because the survey didn't result in sufficient input from small populations that consist of the other residential properties. So commercial village rate derived from hotel, motel properties is applied to all commercial properties. And this is not the first instance where we've considered a homesteaded property discount. In 2014, it was applied to condominiums. We extended that to all residential properties if they're homesteaded or not homesteaded. The survey that I mentioned previously concluded that the permanent residents of Captiva used the beach 57.9% less than non-permanent residents, and thusly we applied that discount to the residential properties. I just want to give a side-by-side comparison of the final model from May of 2014, our last nourishment, versus our current model. You can see they're relatively the same, the exception being the residential properties are all categorized into one, whereas broken apart single family, multifamily, interval on the previous apportionment model. I've taken from the property appraiser's current data to calculate the total just value in each of the zones, as well as the total just value in the residential versus all other properties. And I've calculated them here with kind of like an update to the benefit analysis report that was published in 2019, was what the other data was from. So this is updated, this is more accurate data. And it's all calculated based off the project benefit cost share percentages. So we're able to update the millages as needed, which my understanding is probably going to be changing anyways. I provided, using the current methodology, an example calculation in zones 1 through 5 of the storm protection zones, as well as the residential and commercial other property categories. And I've taken the average property just value and provided an example tax bill based off of all of that data. And this is current as of February 16th, is when this was pulled. And then finally, a visualization of the island by the storm protection zones. You can see it's color coded by which zone is where, as well as the properties that do not receive a storm protection assessment. And that actually concludes the presentation that I put together.
Okay, Mike, do you have a question or two?
Let me unmute here for a second, sorry. It's very difficult for me to see the detail. I'm working on a Microsoft Surface, and I guess I have it reduced to where I can hardly see the panel of people who are here. But, so, no, but I mean, but the rest of the data, is it possible in the future to show larger screen images? Because it seems like you have a lot of information on there, like the next item in the slideshow and so on, that just reduces it to the point of me not being able to read it.
Well, Mike, would it help if you followed along on your Surface just with a regular PowerPoint? Because I can send it over.
You could send it to me, but I'm just saying as a general presentation, if you're presenting to the public, the more data you're putting on the screen, the less the size of any particular piece of it. So like the main screen, which is the color-coded one on the left, should to me be able to fill the whole screen and I'd be able to read it. But
Gotcha.
having the end of slideshow on there and some other stuff, just saying as a general idea for the future, I would change that. And then
Okay.
beyond that,
So that you can see that part of it.
I couldn't hear you, Daniel, sorry.
I'm sorry, I was just saying, I didn't know that you could actually see that part of it. I thought you only saw the slideshow. So that's a misunderstanding on my part of what you can see on your screen.
Okay, yeah, I don't know whether, I was trying to tweak the main screen larger so I could read it, but I couldn't get it to change at all, so. In any event, that's just a future point, but relative to today, my feeling is that, you're explaining the process pretty well. I think that most of what you're telling us about the recreational stuff is assuming that we're going to use the benefits-based approach recommended by the economists. But if the board should recommend going with ad valorem for all residential recreational assessments, all of that kind of goes out the window,
Yes.
except for the commercial piece. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I failed to mention on my previous slide, I did include a line item if we were to go in the ad valorem, so you can kind of see the difference between what the property owners would pay in the ad valorem case versus the benefits-based case. It's the yellow column there in the bottom.
Yeah, one of the things I think, to John's question then, if I had some comments, that was a procedural comment, but I think before the board needs to decide whether we want to share with the community and get, at least let them know that there are two major alternatives that we're looking at here for residential property. I think the storm damage protection is pretty much settled based on the engineering science and their feedback to the economists as to what the apportionment would be for basically beachfront properties that get storm damage benefits. And I think that's pretty much consistent, except to the extent that there is some discount for properties that are homesteaded. But then on the recreational, the big quandary has been that the economists recommended this approach based on who uses the beach and how much. And that's been the larger controversial element with some people on the island. That's not to say that other people don't like it better, but there's been a particular group that found that very unfair and they disputed whether it was a reasonable approach. That's just their opinion. Obviously, they all benefited if we changed it, I think, so they might have had an axe to grind. They're entitled to it. So I think the board needs to make that decision. And then the board needs to decide, do we send out a mailing to all property owners and say, historically, we've done it with a benefits-based approach, but we're looking at a change based on feedback from some community members. And if we did all residential properties for recreational benefits based upon an ad valorem, here's what your number would be. If we do it based upon the economist's recommendation, or however we want to word it, let's not get hung up on the word, but if we did it based upon the economist approach of calling it a benefits-based approach, who gets what benefits, then the factors of who uses the beach and how much and so on come into play, and show them both numbers and not asking them to vote on it, but sharing the data. Because so far we haven't had a lot of feedback from other people, other than those people who reject the idea of the economist's analysis of benefits and based on who uses the beach and how much they use it. Personally, I'm not opposed to this idea of using ad valorem for all recreational benefits, saying that the property appraiser has built in, the value into most of these property values that they put out there. But that's just an opinion. It's an approach. So I think the board needs to decide, how do we want to go forward on this? Because the fact that, 3 people representing maybe a dozen property owners spoke up and were noisy, and we've looked into and put a lot of effort into evaluating their considerations, do we change it based on that, or do we open it up to the whole community so that we've done full disclosure? So I don't know if you have an opinion on that, John.
Well, to me, Mike, again, full disclosure always sounds like the better way to go.
Agreed.
It's don't want to do anything, in the back rooms of anything. So full disclosures. And I gather that will be a little bit more effort because somebody has to do all those calculations. But I think we do the full disclosure. But yeah, you're quite right. We need to really sit down at the board meeting and talk face to face and see what the heck we really think.
Yeah, and on this disclosure point, one of the gentlemen who was advocating to go with ad valorem and didn't like the economist analysis had at one point said, we might have a disclosure issue with our lending organization that we haven't disclosed enough facts about it. And then subsequently, Mike Lanigan, former member of the board, came out and said, well, if people made any assumption whatsoever when they voted on the referendum, they would assume that we're doing things consistent with the way we've always done them. And so, in fact, full disclosure would require us, if we're going to change it and go with a more ad valorem based approach for recreational benefits, they should see that we're considering this alternative versus what's been done in the past. And I agree with that. I think full disclosure requires us sharing it with the community.
Agreed.
That's all I have to say.
Okay, that's fair enough. Dan, picking up on what Mike and Renee had to say earlier about, this beach access issue. Does any of these calculations change other than the top line? Did any of the distribution of these calculations change when we talk about beach access other than South Seas?
So when we're looking at that, I mean, it would change from what I'm understanding, it would change for the recreational portion of it, but the storm benefits would remain the same because they're portioned out by the area there. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that. So I'm looking on the annual benefit there on the top chart that's on the screen. You can see the yellow line, ad valorem, that annual benefit total line there, the 2.417 and the 2.84. Those are broken down by storm benefit versus recreational benefit. And that's the total annual benefit where we calculate the project benefit percentage. So that would change in there. And I would add that within our enabling legislation, it does allow us it has a very broad net, and one of the methodologies to apportion this tax is, it says by any other means that are just and fair. So it would be up to the board at that point to determine what's the most just and fair method to distribute this apportionment.
Hey, John, this is Mike. There's a bigger ramification based upon that point that was alluded to by the lobbyist and then Renee and I picked up on, and that is that the money that we do get from the state and the county and eventually from the Army Corps, if we're able to get it,
Sure.
would be based upon their standards of public access, for example. And I would say the first quarter of a mile into South Seas, that's a quarter of a mile past the Hagerah parking lot, would be entitled to some benefit. But beyond that, I would almost say you calculate the total cost of the project. And when you're apportioning it, before you subtract out of that cost or add into the benefit, the money that comes from the state and the county. So for argument's sake, let's say Captiva's share was going to be 10 million, the state's 10 million and the county's 10 million, and leave the Army Corps out for the moment. I would say you would not give the benefit of that 20 million that's coming based upon access to the South Seas area, or other than the first quarter of a mile, because everybody else on the island are the ones that are within areas of providing public access. So some formula would reduce the amount of benefit that's attributed. Right now, we say the money we get from the government reduces the cost to everybody, regardless of where you are relative to public access. So for example, Whiteman and Leica and Andy Rossi Lane are within a distance of a public parking lot. On the south end, people adjacent to the parking lot here and any other public accesses are helping to fund or helping to justify the funding from these government entities of providing public access. So what you could do is subtract that money, that benefit away from those areas that are being restrictive and give it to those that are closer to public access. Now, again, that's a complicated formula. I don't want to get, oversimplify it here. But the one that's pretty obvious is that a full 2 miles of South Seas is not accessible to the public. And yet they're getting the same benefit of that money that comes from the state and the county and even the Fed eventually if we get it. And that was the argument the Army Corps presented in the first place, is they're getting the benefit of the money, but they're yet hurting your share because they're not being open to the public. So one would argue that you would back those benefits out to those properties and they should pay full freight. That's one way of looking at it.
Got it. Interesting. Mike, one other question then.
Yeah.
Is there something we need to do or could do with respect to just making it more obvious that there is public access to the beach through some of these streets and through parts of, zones 1 through 5 or whatever these numbers are?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have tried to talk to set up a community group that really just dropped the ball and didn't do anything, but to say, make them more aware that access reduces the cost. And they say, we'd rather pay more money and have less visitors. But at the end of the day, that's what they say on the one hand until they see what their bill is on the other hand.
Yeah.
I have had conversations with the owners of McCarthy's Marina, which is, by the way, a half a mile south of Hagerup. So you could argue that it's providing parking for a quarter of a mile in each direction. And we have looked at whether we buy other parking areas. That's very controversial, but this one is a little bit easier because it's already a parking place, except it's not being used all the time. And then we could also potentially ask Twin Waters, the yacht club. We've done some of this before without much success, but if we were to argue that we have other public parking available, and if we were to make a deal, I mean, I asked the people who own McCarthy's Marina, would you want to sell the property and have us lease it back to you on a 99-year lease and allocate a certain amount for you? And they didn't want to do that, but they're very keen to be able to get parking revenue out of it because they used to rent it, even though they weren't legally entitled to use it as a public parking. It was only for customers. And so I think something could be worked out to their benefit and our benefit that would help qualify it for public parking. And similarly, the yacht club potentially could do that, and certainly Twin Waters and others if we put money on the table for them. So that has to be negotiated, but I would start with McCarthy's Marina because that's a big parking area. Now, it might be somewhat controversial in the village because they're the ones that complained after COVID when a lot of people were coming over from the East Coast and parking there, and there wasn't a lot of boats running and a lot of tourism going on within McCarthy's, but they were renting out the places, the parking spaces for people to go to the beach. And they got shut down because some people in the village complained to the county that it's not a public parking. Now they know they could get around it a little bit by selling a keychain to everybody, some insignificant transaction, and they don't want to be underhanded. So they did speak to me about, can we come up with some arrangements that would be mutually beneficial? In our case, it would increase the money we get from the state and the county. It might then make us eligible for as much as $7 to $10 million worth of federal money. So it behooves us to really figure out how to do this to their benefit and ours. Because they would win, they'd keep the revenue. We would win because we would get more money from the cost shares. Did that answer your question, John? I know there was a lot.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, if you want to get over and talk to one of those people, I'll be glad to go over with you and talk and just find out what the parameters are and then bring something back to the board.
I actually have, and I did share it with Jennifer. Jennifer, I don't know if you've had a chance to follow up at all. This was a little while ago, but that would be very useful to sit down and say, how do we actually try to consummate a deal?
Yeah.
Now, I've talked to the yacht club in the past, and in the end, they kind of rejected it. because they felt it would not be manageable relative to being able to, decide who's a yacht club member and who's not. So, that might be a little bit harder. Twin Waters similarly might be short of spaces, but South Seas has spaces in Chadwick at times. We could put meters there. We could put meters in McCarthy's. There's ways to do it using the same metering system we have, and then allocate a certain money back to them, buy a concession and say, let us have your space, and here's available for you so many spaces for whenever you have boats coming and going. There's got to be a logistical method to set it up, but I think that it's a real win-win if we can pull it off.
Okay, let's talk.
Yeah.
All right.
And Bobby is the guy that inherited it. No, he didn't inherit it, but they bought it from the McCarthy family, he and his wife. And he's the guy that pretty much runs the boats. And I want to say Rambo, but I think that's not exact. Rando, Rando. That's who we have to talk to.
So
Okay.
just to clarify, Mike and John, you want me to try to set up some meetings with some of these businesses?
I would
To,
start with Bobby Rando at McCarthy's and see if he's still interested, and then set up a Zoom call where several, on one of these Thursday afternoons where we could sit down and say, hey, how do we bring this to fruition?
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the time, I was thinking primarily of the Army Corps. And then I suddenly said, wait a second, this would help us with the county. It would help us with the state. This is a huge win for us. We don't have to get any money out of parking. All we got to
Okay.
do is get the cost shares.
okay, let me work on that.
Okay. I guess that is done. Is there any other business we need to discuss today?
No, Vice Chair, we do not have any other business. Those are the only two items on the agenda.
Okay. Do I call then for,
You can
well,
simply adjourn under Robert's
simply
rules.
adjourn? It's just us. Okay,
Yeah.
we're adjourned. Thank
Okay,
you,
great. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.